I first met Saeed in the summer of 2010 at a large public event in the city of Munich. He, along with about 20 poets, had been invited to give a reading that evening, one evening, in the old city hall. And I gathered with about 600 other people, packed into this medieval gathering room, a festive hall, and the poets began to read from their writings on the theme of hope. And when Saeed stood and began to read these poems from his book of Psalms, I was utterly taken by the experience. His voice, the clarity of his voice, the strength of his voice, the realness of his voice, and the authenticity of his presence was remarkable. I'd never heard Psalms in modern form like these Psalms. And at the break, I approached him, which is unusual for me to do. I'm a shy person by nature. And asked him if I could translate them because I felt they were important for American or English readers to experience. He immediately said yes, gave me the copy of his book that he was reading from, and that began what's turned out to be a rich and marvelous relationship, friendship, in the arts, in the work of translation. So I began to translate these poems that year in 2010, and have been living with them ever since. They are poems that have shaped my own journey, my own spiritual life profoundly. And what I find so moving about these poems is the way that they voice the range of human experiences, of joy and of delight, of frustration and confusion, of anger, of sadness, of surprise, of happiness. The whole range of feelings that we're invited in every act of prayer to bring before God. These poems are written by a Muslim. Saeed is from a Muslim background. He's Iranian, although he left Iran in the late 1960s as a refugee from Iran during the period of the Shah's regime. Was sent by his family to study in Germany and eventually stayed and has spent his whole life in Germany. He learned German and has become one of the most prominent German writers and poets writing today. What strikes me about Saeed is the presence of his voice. When you meet him or when you hear the poems or read the poems, you feel the authentic search of a human being in the presence of the sacred. With all of the wonder and all of the confusion, all of the hesitancy and all of the joy that search entails. And these poems are, quite frankly, extraordinary. I've never read anything like them. They are a voicing of psalms in a modern idiom, not unlike the ancient biblical psalms, which also have a range of human experience and human emotion in them. When I first began to talk with Saeed and to work with Saeed on these translations, he made it very clear that these would be what he called unsere Psalmen, our psalms. I think he knew that in some ways, once a psalm, a poem, goes from one language into another, the work of translation is itself an artistic act. That's simply truthful. But it's a remarkable, I think, sign of his humility and greatness of character that from the beginning he saw this as a kind of common artistic project. That these psalms would grow in the translation. They would change in the translation. They would become new creations in some ways, even though they took their shape from the German, and in the translation I've rendered them in, they still have something of the directness of his language, of his German, of the vividness of the images he uses, of the surprise of the metaphors that he chooses, and of the audacity of language, which is so distinctive in these psalms. For these reasons, really, the character of these psalms are really poems meant for our time. They're poems I would put in the hands of young people searching for a way in their lives, of older people who perhaps have lost the way or found their lives burdened with discouragement. Because these psalms name the breadth of our experience and provide a kind of welcome for the whole range of feelings, emotions that we carry within us. From the outset, Saeed made it clear that as an Iranian growing up in Iran, as a young man growing up in Iran, he had no chance to learn English. English was a scorned language. It was a language that was not taught in the schools. And so he knows a little bit of English, but not enough to want to try to collaborate in the actual writing of my translations of the poems. He did share them with friends of his in Munich, where he lives, who read English, and I'm sure that they translated the poems into German, and they spoke about the form of my English and of his German. But it was a collaboration that went beyond that kind of direct give and take. And what's remarkable about Saeed from the beginning is his trust that these poems would find their way in my hands. He knew little of me when we first met. We became acquainted over the years that followed, largely through correspondence with each other and through occasional meetings, my trips to Munich to visit with him. The first meeting was unforgettable. He chose a cafe that I didn't know next to the new synagogue in Old Munich, where he lives. We met and spent about 5 hours together talking, as if somehow we'd known each other for decades, as if we were somehow old friends together. So many common sentiments, common convictions, experiences that, while very different from our different backgrounds, found a kind of resonance across the cultural distances between us, which sometimes happens with people when you meet them for the first time and you have that kind of connection. And I felt that with these psalms. I hope that that the readers will feel that as well, that there's a directness of experience in the language that I've rendered them in the English, that I know is consonant with the German as well. The poem begins, as many of his psalms do, with the simple word Lord, Herr, Mr. or Lord. And it goes like this. Lord, I don't want a ravenous wolf or a soft pillow, but only a clearing. Look, I'm sitting in the shadow of your tales and persevere. Don't fear me or my bold wishes. Grant me a space between, a wordless space close by. This is a poem that says so much about our human tendencies to tremble in the presence of God and to wonder how we should live with our deepest feelings. And the poem begins with these two solutions which we often seek, which are finally dead ends for us. To want the ravenous wolf, a kind of image of violence and cruelty, a predator, an animal, a predator among the animals. Or to seek a soft pillow, something that comforts us, which is often needed in our lives. But neither one really brings any kind of self-knowledge. And so after these two alternatives, Lord, I don't want a ravenous wolf or a soft pillow, it comes to the point, but only a clearing. Eine Lichtung in German, a space where light comes into the dense forest and illumines the room, the space in the midst of the woods. And he goes on to describe what it's like to sit in the presence of what he calls the shadows of your tales and persevere, to endure all of the things that we say about God, some of them true, many of them not true, and to sort out how to live our lives in the presence of those deceptions on our part, those confusions, those uncertainties. And then this remarkable line, don't fear me. As if somehow when we come with that kind of clarity in our lives and strength, we need to ask God not to be afraid of us, to welcome us with the same kind of courage and the same kind of boldness that we hope to bring to our experience of God, our encounter with God. Don't fear me or my bold wishes, he writes. And then these closing lines, grant me a space between. Grant me a space between, and a wordless space close by. These lines mean so much to me because they give a sense of the shape of what the spiritual life is all about. First, to always seek a clearing. No matter how dense the forest of our lives, to seek for a place where the light penetrates the darkness of the woods and opens a space for us to breathe, to see, to delight in the coming of the light. And of course, a clearing has its power because the woods are dark and they are confusing and they can be threatening, which is true for so much of our life as well. So this prayer to welcome a clearing in our life, to create a space between, a wordless space close by, is a beautiful prayer of what it means to open our lives, to trust in the goodness of the world around us, and the goodness of the God who comes to us in the midst of those fears, those confusions, those frustrations, and sometimes those angers. So this psalm, like many of the psalms, charts, I think, a direction that we might find clarity and purpose and meaning in our lives. When these books were published in 2007 in German, the title was simply Psalmen, which means Psalms, no definite or indefinite article, simply Psalms. And we've published them in this edition, this New English translation, as 99 Psalms, because there are in fact 99. The number 99 is a significant number in Sufi wisdom traditions, because there's an old teaching that goes back to the earliest centuries of the Sufi wise sages that suggests that there are 100 names of God, 100 ways to know God, but only 99 are known to us. There's always one name that God never reveals to us. And that reticence, that refusal, if you will, is always a reminder that whatever we know of God, God is always beyond that knowing. The very first poem in this collection actually begins with that prayer. He says, "Reveal to me," at the end of this psalm, "reveal to me all of your names, even the last, the hidden." And of course, that search to know everything about the divine is an unending search for us. The Sufis knew that that would never be granted, but the search itself was worth the pursuit. That our lives are shaped by the things we seek, the things we desire, and that hidden name of God always calls us beyond the certainties of the names we use to speak of God to the deepest truth about the divine, which is beyond names, which is beyond knowing, and which is certainly beyond any kind of naming. So the 99 Psalms of Saeed.